In the rugged canyons of Arizona Territory, 1885, a young woman's gentle touch could mend a wounded calf at dawn and read tracks invisible to most by sunset. Eleanor Blackwood had grown up learning the secrets of the land from a father whose past remained shrouded in mystery. But when the ruthless Diamondback gang arrived at Shadow Creek Ranch, they saw only a frightened rancher's daughter guarding her father's property alone. That mistake would cost them everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested over Redstone Canyon, painting the Arizona landscape in hues of amber and copper as Eleanor Blackwood finished mending the fence line along the eastern pasture. At 23, she possessed a quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of self-reliance, her movements economical and purposeful as she hammered the last nail into place. The years of working beside her father had left her hands calloused but capable, her sun-bronzed skin a testament to days spent under the unforgiving western sky. Eleanor's honey-blonde hair was tied back in a practical braid, though wayward strands had escaped to frame her face, a face that combined her mother's delicate features with her father's watchful intensity. Most folks in Silverwater County remarked that she had Clara's beauty, but Thomas's eyes, alert, perceptive, and somehow older than her years. Beneath her simple work clothes, a faded blue cotton shirt tucked into practical canvas trousers, Eleanor carried herself with the balanced posture of someone always ready to move, to react, to survive. Few people in these parts would guess that the young woman who brought the best peach preserves to the Silverwater Harvest Festival was the same person who could disappear into the landscape at will, who could read boot prints like most folks read newspapers, who could hit a moving target from horseback at full gallop. That was precisely how Thomas Blackwood had raised her to be, underestimated by design. Wiping sweat from her brow, Eleanor gathered her tools and whistled for Mercury, her silver dapple gelding who grazed nearby. The horse lifted his head, trotting over with the easy familiarity of a long-time companion. "Good boy," she murmured, stroking his velvety muzzle before mounting with practiced ease. "Let's check the north fence before heading back." Shadow Creek Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, nestled between the jagged Redstone Mountains and the meandering Silver Bow River. The Blackwood spread wasn't the largest in Yavapai County, but it was among the most prosperous, a prosperity built on Eleanor's father's uncanny ability to find water where others found only dust, and to track lost cattle through terrain that swallowed other ranchers' herds whole. As Eleanor rode the boundary line, her eyes constantly scanned the landscape, reading it like a book written in a language few understood. She noticed the three-toed tracks of a passing coyote, the disturbed earth where a rattlesnake had recently slithered, the subtle signs of deer passing through the brush before dawn. These were the lessons Thomas Blackwood had instilled in his daughter since she could walk, lessons he claimed to have learned from Navajo scouts during his time as a cavalry officer, though Eleanor had long suspected there was more to that story than he revealed. Near the northern boundary, Eleanor reined Mercury to a stop, her attention caught by something out of place. Dismounting, she crouched to examine faint impressions in the dirt. Boot prints, not the familiar treads of the ranch hands' worn work boots, but the distinctive pattern of city-made footwear. Alongside them, horseshoe prints from at least 4 animals, one bearing a distinctive chip in the right front shoe. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Strangers had crossed Blackwood land recently, not taking the main road, but cutting across rarely used game trails. People who didn't want to be seen. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from the direction of the ranch house. Eleanor mounted Mercury and nudged him homeward, though her pace remained unhurried. No sense in alarming whoever was visiting if it was innocent, and no sense in revealing her concern if it wasn't. As the ranch house came into view, Eleanor spotted 3 unfamiliar horses tied at the hitching post. Fine animals, well-bred and well-kept, with saddles that spoke of money. Standing on the wraparound porch was Sheriff Miller Hayes, his weathered face grave beneath his salt-and-pepper mustache, speaking with Janice Parker, their nearest neighbor from 10 miles west. "Eleanor," Janice called, relief evident in her voice. The older woman had been like a mother to Eleanor since Clara Blackwood had succumbed to fever 8 years prior. "Thank goodness you're back." Eleanor dismounted, keeping her movements casual. Despite the tension, she could read in both Hayes's and Janice's postures. "Sheriff, Mrs. Parker, what brings you both out to Shadow Creek today?" Hayes twisted his hat in his hands. "Was hoping to speak with your father, Miss Blackwood. Is he around?" Eleanor unsaddled Mercury, taking her time before answering. "He rode out 3 days ago, tracking some strays that broke through the south fence during that storm." It wasn't entirely untrue. Thomas Blackwood had indeed left after the storm, though tracking strays was only part of his purpose. "Any idea when he'll return?" Hayes pressed. Eleanor shrugged, leading Mercury to the water trough. "He said it might be a week. Those canyons to the south are treacherous." "Why? What happened?" Hayes and Janice exchanged glances before the sheriff spoke. "The Diamondback gang hit the Prescott Bank yesterday. Shot 2 men. Word is they're heading this way, following the old stage route." Eleanor kept her expression neutral as she absorbed this information. The Diamondback gang had been terrorizing the Arizona territory for months, a group of ex-Confederate soldiers turned outlaws, led by a man known only as the Colonel. They were methodical, brutal, and until now had operated far from Yavapai County. "They've been seen heading this direction?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady. "Jackson over at Clearwater Station saw 5 riders matching their description pass through early this morning," Hayes confirmed. "They didn't stop, just watered their horses and moved on. They're following the river, which means they'll pass right by Shadow Creek," Eleanor finished. The ranch's location along the Silver Bow made it a natural stopping point for anyone traveling the backcountry between Prescott and the territorial border. "Eleanor, honey," Janice stepped forward, concern etched in the lines of her face. "Why don't you come stay with us until Thomas returns? It's not safe for a young woman alone with those men." Eleanor busied herself with removing Mercury's bridle, considering her response carefully. "That's kind, Mrs. Parker, but I can't leave the ranch unattended. We've got calving heifers in the south pasture, and someone needs to be here when the hands return from the cattle drive." What she didn't say was that Shadow Creek Ranch held secrets buried beneath the floorboards of the study, hidden in the false wall of the root cellar, cached in locations only she and her father knew. Secrets from Thomas Blackwood's past life before he became a respectable rancher 20 years ago. "At least take this," Hayes said, offering a Remington revolver from his saddlebag, extra protection just in case. Eleanor almost smiled at the irony as she accepted the gun with appropriate hesitation. She checked the cylinder with practiced hands, then tucked it into her belt. "Thank you, Sheriff, I'll be careful." What Hayes didn't know was that in the ranch house gun cabinet, hidden behind the displayed hunting rifles and shotguns, was an arsenal that would make any frontier marshal raise his eyebrows, or that beneath Eleanor's bed lay a Winchester rifle, modified by her father to shoot with unparalleled accuracy, a weapon she could use to hit a playing card at 100 yards. Thomas Blackwood had ensured his daughter could protect herself long before Sheriff Hayes thought to offer a 6-shooter. After extracting promises that Eleanor would bar her doors at night and fire 3 shots if trouble arose, Hayes and Janice reluctantly departed. Eleanor watched them ride away, waiting until they disappeared around the bend before hurrying into the house. She moved with swift efficiency, gathering supplies and preparing for what might come. In her father's study, Eleanor knelt before the massive oak desk, her fingers finding the hidden latch beneath the right-hand drawer. The false bottom opened to reveal a leather-bound journal filled with her father's precise handwriting. She flipped through the pages until she found what she sought, a detailed description of the Diamondback Gang written 3 months ago. The Colonel James Harrington, former cavalry officer, dishonorable discharge, favors Remington rolling block rifle, scar from right temple to jaw, left-handed, ruthless but disciplined. Tactical thinker. Samuel Wade, former sharpshooter, blue bandana, quick temper, uses twin Colt Navy revolvers, weakness, impulsive. Brothers Ethan and Michael Denton, explosives experts, always work together. Preferred dynamite for bank vaults. Michael is missing 2 fingers on right hand. Calvin Reed, young, sandy hair, newest member, former stable boy from Virginia, decent rider, poor shot, the weak link. Eleanor traced her finger over the neat script, wondering how her father had compiled such detailed information on outlaws operating hundreds of miles away. It wasn't the first time Thomas Blackwood had demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible for a simple rancher to possess. Her father had always been vague about his past before settling in Arizona Territory. Eleanor knew he had served in the Union Army during the war between the states, that he had worked as a scout afterward, that he had traveled extensively through Indian territories. But there were gaps in his history, pieces that didn't quite fit together. Like the wooden chest in the root cellar that contained 3 different sets of identification papers, or the coded messages that occasionally arrived from as far away as Washington, D.C., or the night riders who sometimes came after midnight, speaking in hushed tones with her father before disappearing before dawn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor had learned early not to ask direct questions. Instead, she watched and listened, gathering fragments of information. Over the years, she'd concluded long ago that Thomas Blackwood was not merely the retired cavalry scout and successful rancher he presented to the world. Whatever his true past, it had equipped him with skills far beyond those of ordinary men. Skills he had methodically passed on to his only child. By the time Eleanor was 12, she could track game across bare rock, read sign that most trained scouts would miss, and shoot with accuracy that bordered on uncanny. By 16, she could identify every plant with medicinal or poisonous properties in the territory, craft disguises convincing enough to fool their own ranch hands, and speak 3 native languages with perfect accent. Eleanor remembered clearly the day her father began teaching her to shoot. She'd been just 7 years old, small for her age, but determined to make her father proud. "A gun's not a toy, Ellie girl," Thomas had said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "It's a tool like any other. Respect it, understand it, master it, and it might save your life someday." He'd started her with a small .22 rifle, teaching her to disassemble, clean, and reassemble it blindfolded before she ever fired a shot. When she finally did shoot, Thomas insisted on perfect form, stance balanced, breathing controlled, mind focused. "Shooting isn't about strength," he'd explained when she struggled with the rifle's weight. "It's about patience, about knowing exactly when to exhale, when to squeeze, not pull the trigger, about becoming so connected to your weapon that it feels like an extension of your own body." For 3 years, Thomas had Eleanor practice daily, starting with stationary targets, then moving ones, then targets she could barely see. He taught her to account for wind, elevation, humidity, to adapt to any weapon that came to hand, to hit her mark under stress, in darkness, while injured. "Why do I need to know all this, Pa?" she'd asked once, after a particularly grueling session that left her hands blistered and her shoulders aching. Thomas had gone quiet, his weathered face solemn in the fading light. "Because the world's full of predators, Ellie. Some wear badges, some wear suits, some look just like ordinary folk. I need to know you can handle whatever comes, whether I'm here or not." Only years later did Eleanor begin to understand the haunted look that sometimes crossed her father's face, the look of a man who'd seen too much, who carried burdens he couldn't share, who knew exactly what dangers lurked beyond their peaceful. A ranch, just frontier skills, her father would say with a wink whenever she mastered a particularly difficult lesson. Might save your life someday, Ellie girl. Eleanor returned the journal to its hiding place and moved to the gun cabinet. Behind the everyday weapons, she activated another hidden catch, revealing a false back. From this secret compartment, she selected a Colt Frontier revolver with custom grips fitted perfectly to her hand and a lever-action Winchester rifle that had been carefully modified for balance and accuracy. Next, she changed into riding clothes, sturdy canvas pants beneath a split skirt that wouldn't restrict movement, a cotton shirt under a leather vest with hidden pockets for ammunition, and worn boots with special compartments in the heels. She braided her chestnut hair tightly, tucking it beneath a wide-brimmed hat. To the casual observer, she would appear to be exactly what they expected, a rancher's daughter dressed practically for chores. Only the most observant would notice the subtle alterations to her clothing that allowed for quick access to hidden weapons. As evening approached, Eleanor moved through the ranch house, making preparations that appeared ordinary but served strategic purposes. She lit lamps in specific rooms while leaving others dark, creating the impression of a routine evening. She left a pie cooling on the windowsill, visible from the yard, the picture of domestic tranquility. But she also scattered broken glass beneath key windows, positioned furniture to provide cover, and cached weapons at critical points throughout the house. She paused in the kitchen, running her fingers along the rough-hewn table where her family had shared thousands of meals. The ranch house, built by Thomas Blackwood's own hands before Eleanor was born, contained countless hidden compartments, reinforced walls, and escape routes that no casual observer would ever notice. Growing up, Eleanor had thought such features were common in frontier homes. Only as she matured did she realize how unusual their precautions were. Always have at least 3 ways out of any room, her father would remind her. Always keep something between you and potential danger. Always prepare for the worst while appearing to expect the best. As a child, his lessons had seemed like elaborate games. Eleanor spent hours learning to move silently through the house, finding hidden caches, creating distractions. Now, as she prepared for real danger, she was grateful for every seemingly paranoid precaution her father had drilled into her. In the parlor, Eleanor moved the heavy oak sideboard 3 inches to the left, revealing a small hole in the floorboards. Through this peephole, she could observe anyone entering the front of the house while remaining hidden in the root cellar below. In the dining room, she adjusted a decorative mirror to reflect the approach to the back door. In her bedroom, she removed 3 books from the shelf, activating a mechanism that unlocked a compartment containing throwing knives, a garrote wire, and packets of powders whose origins her father had never fully explained. "Just herbs," he'd said when she'd asked. "Some make sleep come quick, others, well, let's hope you never need the others." From the barn, Eleanor selected 4 horses, Mercury for speed, Thunder for endurance, Storm for strength, and Shadow for stealth, and prepared them for quick departure if necessary. She secured supplies in saddlebags and cached additional provisions in 3 locations around the property. As darkness fell, Eleanor sat on the porch, rocking gently in her mother's old chair, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a shotgun hidden in the folds of fabric across her lap. To anyone watching, she was simply enjoying the cool evening air before retiring. In reality, she was scanning the landscape, noting every shadow, identifying each night sound, distinguishing between the natural rhythms of the ranch and any disruption that might signal danger. The quarter moon cast silver light across the yard, transforming familiar shapes into ghostly sentinels. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their yips and howls carrying across the canyon. A breeze rustled through the cottonwoods lining the creek, creating a gentle susurration that masked subtler sounds. Eleanor closed her eyes, focusing her hearing as her father had taught her, the breeze in the trees, the distant coyotes, an owl's soft hoot from the barn rafters, the familiar creaking of the house as it cooled in the night air, the rhythmic cricket songs. And there, nearly imperceptible, the soft nickering of a horse responding to the presence of other horses, not from the direction of the ranch's corral, but from the shadow of the western ridge where the property bordered unclaimed canyon land. Eleanor didn't open her eyes immediately. Instead, she maintained her relaxed posture, continuing to rock. Steadily, while extending her senses outward, she counted the faint sounds, at least 4 horses, possibly 5. She detected the metallic clink of spurs, the soft leather creak of a saddle as someone shifted weight. Visitors watching the ranch house, assessing, waiting. The Diamondback gang had arrived at Shadow Creek, finding what they believed was easy: prey. A young woman alone on an isolated ranch. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile in the darkness. These men had no idea what awaited them, or whose daughter they were about to threaten. Thomas Blackwood hadn't simply been a cavalry scout. The scattered pieces Eleanor had assembled over the years pointed to something far more lethal: a government operative, a hunter of men, a specialist in tracking those who didn't wish to be found. Whatever her father's true profession had been, he had trained his daughter to follow in his footsteps, preparing her for precisely this moment. Eleanor opened her eyes, gazing placidly at the moon-silvered landscape, while her mind calculated distances, angles, and approaches. The waiting game had begun. By morning, the Diamondback gang would make their move, confident in their superior numbers and firepower, expecting to find a frightened woman easy to intimidate or control. As she rocked, memories of her father's teachings flowed through her mind, lessons that now seemed almost prophetic. The most dangerous opponent isn't always the strongest or fastest, Thomas had told her during one of their training sessions high in the Canyonlands. It's the one who knows the terrain, who's prepared, who waits for the perfect moment to strike. He'd demonstrated by having her hunt him across the rocky landscape. For 3 days, 16-year-old Eleanor had tracked her father through canyons and washes, using every skill he'd taught her. Yet each time she thought she'd cornered him, he'd somehow vanished, only to reappear behind her. How? She demanded in frustration after the 3rd time he'd managed to circle around her position undetected. Thomas had smiled, that rare, genuine smile reserved only for his daughter. "Because I'm fighting on my terms, not yours. I choose when to be seen and when to disappear. I decide when to move and when to stay still. I control the encounter." Now, 7 years later, Eleanor understood completely. The Diamondback gang believed they were the hunters, observing unsuspecting prey. In reality, she had already identified their position, assessed their numbers, and begun planning their defeat. They were playing a game whose rules they didn't even know existed. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the silver pendant at her throat. Her mother's locket, containing a small photograph of Clara and Thomas Blackwood on their wedding day. Whatever secrets her father kept, whatever mysterious past he concealed, Eleanor knew one truth with absolute certainty. Thomas Blackwood had spent 20 years preparing his daughter for this moment. What the Diamondback gang would discover was not a frightened rancher's daughter, but a predator in her natural habitat, the daughter of one of the most dangerous men ever to ride the Western Territories. Eleanor Blackwood had been raised by a phantom, taught by a legend, and the skills flowing through her veins were about to become the stuff of frontier tales. As the night deepened, Eleanor continued her peaceful rocking, the perfect picture of A blissful ignorance, while inside her mind she was already several moves ahead in a deadly chess game that had only just begun. Dawn broke across Shadow Creek Ranch with deceptive serenity. Eleanor had maintained her vigil through most of the night, catching only brief moments of rest while remaining alert to any change in the nighttime sounds. She detected movement twice, once when the observers rotated positions, and again when one rider departed, presumably to report back to their main group. As the first pale light filtered across the landscape, Eleanor went about her morning. Chores with deliberate normalcy. She stoked the cook stove, collected eggs from the henhouse, and set coffee to boil, all visible activities that could be observed from the ridgeline where the diamondback watchers remained hidden. Let them think her oblivious, she thought, feeding kitchen scraps to the chickens with unhurried movements. 20 miles east of Shadow Creek, at the abandoned Willow Creek Station, James the Colonel. Harrington studied the crude map spread across an overturned barrel. The former cavalry officer's scarred face remained impassive as he listened to Calvin Reed's report. Just like Jackson said, Blackwood's away tracking strays. Place is being run by his daughter. She's alone except for a couple of hands who ain't due back for days, Reed explained, his sandy hair still dusty from the nighttime ride. Sheriff Hayes and some woman visited yesterday, warned her about us, but she's staying put. The colonel's piercing gray eyes narrowed slightly. This daughter, what's she like? Reed shrugged. Pretty enough. Seems capable around the ranch. Moves like she knows what she's doing, but she's just a girl. Didn't spot any arsenal, just normal range weapons. And the layout? Main house faces west, 2 stories. Barn about 50 yards north. Bunkhouse empty. Creek runs along the eastern property. Nearest neighbors is Parker Place, about 10 miles west. The colonel nodded, his gloved finger tracing the route on the map. Samuel Wade, his blue bandana knotted loosely around his neck, looked up from cleaning his matched Colt revolvers. Why? Are we wasting time with some ranch, Colonel? Thought we were headed for the border. The colonel's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Because, Mr. Wade, Thomas Blackwood's property happens to sit directly on the most discreet route to the Mexican border, because his water rights control the only reliable crossing point for 50 miles, and because I don't leave witnesses or potential pursuers at my back. He straightened, his tall frame imposing despite his lean build. More importantly, Blackwood's name has crossed my desk before. This caught the attention of the Denton brothers, who had been quietly inventorying their dynamite supplies in the corner. What do you mean, Colonel? Ethan Denton asked, the older and more cautious of the two. The colonel's finger traced the scar that ran from his temple to jaw, a souvenir from a Cheyenne blade years ago. Army Intelligence 71 reports of a specialist tracking deserters and Confederate holdouts across the territories. Men who could follow a trail others couldn't even see. They called him the Ghost. Some said he wasn't real, just a story to keep renegades looking over their shoulders. Wade snorted. And you think some rancher is this Ghost? I think, the colonel said carefully, that a man with those skills might eventually seek a quiet life, might settle somewhere strategic, might raise a child to carry on certain traditions. He folded the map deliberately. Regardless, Shadow Creek Ranch controls access to our escape route. We need those water rights secured and any potential witnesses eliminated. The fact that only a young woman stands in our way simply makes our task easier. Michael Denton, the younger brother with the mutilated hand, grinned unpleasantly. Been a while since we had a female company, Colonel. The colonel's gaze turned glacial. Miss Blackwood will be treated with professional courtesy until I determine what, if anything, she knows about her father's activities. After that, she becomes a liability to be eliminated efficiently. Is that understood? Michael's grin faltered under that cold stare. Yes, Colonel? Good. We move on Shadow Creek at midday. Mr. Reed will guide us in. The girl will likely be more receptive to cooperation if we appear civilized. The colonel checked his pocket watch, a gold timepiece taken from a Union general at Antietam. Mr. Wade, you and the Dentons prepare the horses. We depart in 1 hour. Back at Shadow Creek Ranch, Eleanor had completed her visible morning chores and now worked in the root cellar, hidden from watching eyes. She moved with quick efficiency, checking the weapons cache her father had maintained for years. The cellar itself was a marvel of engineering disguised as simple frontier construction. Thomas Blackwood had created a space with multiple exits, reinforced walls that could withstand small artillery, and a hidden well that provided fresh water. One corner housed a telegraph key connected to a line that ran underground for nearly a mile before connecting to the main wire, a modification Thomas had installed 5 years earlier without explaining why a cattle rancher might need private communications. Eleanor considered sending a message to the nearest marshal's office, but hesitated. The Diamondback Gang's presence was concerning, but not yet an immediate threat. More importantly, she didn't want to reveal capabilities that might expose her father's secrets. Thomas Blackwood had drummed one lesson into her above all others. Information is more valuable than gold, Ellie girl. Never reveal what you know until you absolutely must. Instead, she focused on practical preparations. She loaded and checked each weapon. The Winchester rifle with its custom sights, the matched Remington revolvers her father had presented on her 18th birthday, the Derringer designed to be concealed in a lady's boot, and several knives of varying lengths and purposes. From a locked chest, Eleanor withdrew packets of her father's special ammunition, bullets he'd crafted himself with modifications that made them more accurate, more damaging, or in some cases, capable of effects Eleanor preferred not to dwell upon. She distributed these throughout her clothing and around the house, ensuring she would never be more than arm's reach from a weapon, regardless of where an encounter might occur. As she worked, Eleanor's mind tallied what she knew about the Diamondback Gang. 5 members, led by a former military officer with tactical training. They specialized in bank robberies, but had also hit stagecoaches and, recently, a payroll train near Flagstaff. They left few witnesses and were known for calculated brutality, rather than impulsive violence. But why come to Shadow Creek? The ranch held considerable value: prime grazing land, essential water rights, a strategic location. But it wasn't the type of target the Diamondbacks typically hit. They sought cash, gold, and immediate payoffs. Shadow Creek's value was in its land and position, assets that couldn't be quickly converted to cash or easily transported, unless they needed something specific that the ranch provided. The water crossing, perhaps, or a secure place to hide while pursuit died down. Or was it something else entirely, something connected to her father's mysterious past? Eleanor checked the cellar's hidden peephole, which provided a clear view of the yard and approached to the house. No movement yet, but the day was young. She closed and secured the root cellar, making her way back to the kitchen through a concealed passage that emerged behind the pantry shelves. In the kitchen, Eleanor prepared for her visitors. She set bread dough to rise, an ordinary domestic task that would support her appearance as simply a rancher's daughter. Then she brewed a pot of coffee laced with herbs from a special tin her father kept for particularly troublesome guests. The mixture wouldn't kill, but anyone drinking it would find their reflexes slowed and their thinking clouded within 30 minutes. Next, she arranged the kitchen and main room to her advantage. She slightly weakened one chair leg at the table, ensuring it would collapse if significant weight was applied. She positioned mirrors to eliminate blind spots. She made sure pathways to her hidden weapons remained clear, while appearing to be simply the natural arrangement of frontier furniture. By mid-morning, Eleanor had transformed Shadow Creek Ranch into an elaborate trap disguised as an ordinary homestead. Now she needed to transform herself. In her bedroom, Eleanor exchanged her practical work clothes for a more feminine outfit, a modest blue calico dress with a high collar and long sleeves that concealed the knife sheath strapped to her forearm. She arranged her honey blonde hair in a simple style that suggested innocence, while keeping it secured away from her face, where it wouldn't impede her vision or movement. She applied a touch of her mother's old rose water, not enough to seem like she was expecting company, but sufficient to create an impression of femininity and vulnerability. The overall effect, when she surveyed herself in the mirror, was precisely what she intended: a respectable young woman who might be capable of managing household affairs, but would surely be overwhelmed by dangerous men. The mirror reflected exactly what the Diamondback gang would expect to see, exactly what would lead them to underestimate her fatally. Eleanor slipped a small derringer into her right pocket and a pouch of her father's special powder into her left. Then she made her way downstairs to continue her performance of ordinary domesticity, all while keeping her senses attuned to the approach she knew would come. Shortly after noon, as Eleanor was pointedly hanging laundry in the yard where she could be easily observed, she detected the subtle signs of approaching riders, not from the direction of the main road, but circling around to approach from the east, using the creek bed to muffle the sound of hooves. A clever approach, she thought, pinning one of her father's shirts to the line with deliberate, unhurried movements. They were coming in from the direction opposite the ridgeline where their observers had been positioned, a classic pincer movement designed to cut off escape routes. The colonel was indeed a tactician. Eleanor counted 5 distinct patterns of hoof falls. The entire gang, then. She continued hanging laundry, allowing no change in her rhythm that might betray her awareness. Only when the riders emerged from the tree line, now clearly visible, and making no effort to conceal their approach, did Eleanor permit herself to startle, dropping a damp pillowcase in apparent surprise. The Diamondback gang rode in formation toward the ranch house, their posture and spacing revealing their military background. At their head rode a tall man on a magnificent black stallion, his bearing regal despite trail dust, his scarred face impassive beneath a wide-brimmed black hat. The colonel, unmistakably. To his right, a wiry man with a blue bandana, Samuel Wade. To his left, the sandy-haired Calvin Reed, looking uncomfortable. Behind them, the Denton brothers on matching sorrels, Michael's mutilated hand clearly visible on the reins. Eleanor clutched her laundry basket to her chest, the picture of alarmed femininity, while her mind calculated distances, identified weapons, and noted that all 5 men had staggered their equipment for quick access. These weren't common bandits. They were a coordinated unit. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the colonel called as they approached, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern education layered over Southern origins. "Might we trouble you for some water? Been a long ride." Eleanor took a step back, allowing appropriate wariness to show on her face. "Who are you, gentlemen?" The colonel removed his hat with a courtly gesture that seemed incongruous with his scarred visage. "Just travelers, ma'am, heading south. Your ranch happens to sit on the most direct route. The main road passes 5 miles west of here," Eleanor pointed out, her voice carefully modulated to show concern without accusation. "Indeed, it does," the colonel agreed smoothly. "But the terrain there is difficult for our loaded horses. We, who heard Shadow Creek Ranch was known for its hospitality to weary travelers." Eleanor hesitated, playing her role. "My father's away at present, tracking strays in the South Canyons." "Thomas Blackwood, isn't it?" the colonel asked, watching her reaction carefully. "A renowned tracker, from what I've heard." The casual mention of her father's name, delivered with subtle emphasis, confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. This wasn't a random encounter. The Diamondback gang had come to Shadow Creek for specific reasons connected to Thomas Blackwood himself. "You've heard of my father?" Eleanor allowed genuine surprise to color her voice. The colonel smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. A man with his skills develops a reputation. I served with scouts during the war, came to appreciate men who could read sign the way your father can. He dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to Reed. I'm Colonel James Harrington, formerly of the Confederate Army. These are my associates, Mr. Wade, Mr. Reed, and the Denton brothers, Ethan and Michael. Eleanor noted how he offered a military title, but no explanation for why he traveled with armed men years after the war's end. The implicit question hung in the air. Would she challenge his story or accept it at face value? Eleanor Blackwood, she replied, dropping a slight curtsy that suggested proper Eastern finishing school education, another calculated detail to shape their perception of her. I suppose I could offer refreshments, though I wasn't expecting company. Most kind. Miss Blackwood, the colonel responded with an approving nod. We won't impose long. Perhaps just water for our horses and a moment to rest in the shade. Eleanor gestured toward the water trough near the barn. Help yourselves. I just made fresh coffee, if you'd care for some while your horses drink. Wade and the younger Denton exchanged glances that Eleanor pretended not to notice, a silent communication that suggested suspicion or anticipation. The colonel, however, maintained his gentlemanly facade. Coffee would be most welcome. Been subsisting on trail brew for too long. He turned to his men. Mr. Reed, see the horses. Mr. Wade remains with Mr. Reed. Denton's with me. The casual orders, delivered without explanation and immediately obeyed, reinforced the military discipline. Within the group, Eleanor led the colonel and Denton brothers toward the house, her posture deliberately relaxed while her mind remained hyper-alert. As they approached the porch, Eleanor glanced toward the ridge where she'd detected the observers the previous night. Empty now. The gang had consolidated its forces for this approach, a tactical decision that revealed confidence, but also created a potential vulnerability. With all 5 men now accounted for, there would be no unexpected reinforcements or observers positioned to report if things went wrong. Lovely property, the colonel remarked as they climbed the porch steps. Your father has built quite the operation here. It's been in the family for 20 years now, Eleanor replied, opening the front door and gesturing inside. Please, make yourselves comfortable in the parlor. I'll fetch that coffee. As the men entered, Eleanor noted how the colonel's eyes immediately scanned the room, taking in sightlines, exits, defensive positions, the automatic assessment of a trained soldier entering unknown territory. His gaze lingered momentarily on the gun cabinet, the family photographs, the layout of furniture, cataloging, analyzing, planning. The elder Denton brother remained near the door, his posture suggesting readiness despite his outwardly relaxed demeanor. The younger brother, Michael, moved immediately to the window that overlooked the yard where Wade and Reed attended the horses, positioning himself to maintain visual contact with the rest of their group. Coordinated professional behavior that confirmed Eleanor's assessment of their capabilities. Your father's reputation as a tracker is quite remarkable, the colonel commented as he selected a seat, the sturdy armchair rather than the doctored dining chair Eleanor had positioned invitingly. They say he can follow a trail that's days old across hard rock and flowing water. Eleanor moved toward the kitchen, maintaining the expected physical distance of a proper young woman entertaining male strangers. Pa has a gift for reading. Sign, it's true. Taught me a little, though I'm nowhere near his skill. The colonel's eyes sharpened with interest. Oh? What has he taught you, Miss Blackwood? Eleanor allowed herself a self-deprecating smile. Just basics. Following deer tracks, identifying which strays belong to which herd, that sort of thing. Enough to be useful around the ranch, nothing more. As she stepped into the kitchen to prepare the coffee, Eleanor continued to track the men's positions. By sound and the reflections in strategically placed mirrors, The colonel remained seated, apparently at ease. Ethan Denton maintained his position by the door. Michael Denton continued his surveillance from the window. Eleanor prepared the coffee tray, adding her father's special mixture to 3 cups while leaving 2 untreated for Wade and Reed, who remained outside. As she worked, she maintained a one-sided conversation through the open doorway, prattling about ranch life, local gossip, the challenges of managing without her father, all carefully crafted to reinforce their perception of her as an ordinary young woman out of her depth. "I do hope Pa returns soon," she called, arranging cups on the tray. "He's much better at managing visitors than I am. Been gone 3 days now, but he said it might be a week before he found all the strays." The colonel's response was measured, conversational. "Cattle ranching is demanding work. I imagine a man like your father has taught you to be self-sufficient in his absence." "Oh, I manage the household well enough," Eleanor replied, returning to the parlor with the loaded tray. "But Pa handles the business matters and security. These are unsettled times after all." She set the tray on the small table and began pouring, making sure to hand the treated cups to the colonel and Denton brothers. "Milk or sugar, gentlemen?" The colonel declined both, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Tell me, Miss Blackwood, has your father spoken much about his time during the war, or his activities afterward?" Eleanor feigned mild confusion while handing Ethan Denton his coffee. "Pa doesn't talk much about those days. I know he scouted for the Union Army, and afterward worked for the cavalry in some capacity." "Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity," the colonel replied, taking a careful sip. "As I mentioned, I commanded scouts myself. Always interested in hearing about others in the profession." Eleanor served Michael Denton next, noting how his mutilated hand, missing the ring and little fingers, grasped the cup awkwardly. The young man's eyes traveled over her figure with undisguised interest that Eleanor pretended not to notice. "This is mighty fine coffee, Miss Blackwood," the colonel remarked. "A rare pleasure out here in the territories." "My mother's recipe," Eleanor responded, taking her own untreated cup and seating herself at a proper distance. "She brought her Virginia standards with her to the frontier, said civilization began with properly brewed coffee." The conversation continued, a deadly dance of pleasantries layered over calculations and assessments. The colonel inquired about local conditions, water availability, the ranch's operations, questions that might seem like polite conversation, but revealed his interest in Shadow Creek's strategic value. Eleanor answered with carefully calibrated information, some accurate, some misleading, all designed to maintain her facade while assessing the gang's intentions. Outside, through the window, Eleanor noted Wade growing restless, pacing near the horses while Reed watered them. The younger man seemed nervous, his eyes constantly darting between the house and the surrounding landscape. 15 minutes into their conversation, Eleanor observed the first signs that her special coffee was taking effect. The colonel's blinks grew fractionally slower. Ethan Denton shifted his weight more frequently, as though finding it difficult to maintain his vigilant posture. Michael Denton's already crude gaze became slightly unfocused. The herbs were working, subtly impairing judgment, slowing reflexes, dulling alertness. Not enough to create obvious impairment, but sufficient to give Eleanor a critical edge when the inevitable confrontation came. And it would come. The colonel's questions had grown increasingly pointed, his interest in Thomas Blackwood's whereabouts and activities too specific to be a casual curiosity. Whatever connection existed between the Diamondback Gang's leader and her father, it went beyond professional respect between former military men. "Your father," the colonel said, setting down his empty cup, "would he happen to have kept any souvenirs from his army days, papers, maps, perhaps items of historical interest?" The question confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. The gang wasn't here simply for the strategic location or to eliminate witnesses. They sought something specific, something they believed Thomas Blackwood possessed. Pa's not one for keepsakes. Eleanor answered carefully. Says the past is best left buried. The colonel's scarred face revealed nothing, but Eleanor caught the slight tensing of his shoulders. Wise philosophy. Though sometimes the past has a way of resurfacing, doesn't it? The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, the pretense of friendly travelers wearing thin. Through the window, Eleanor saw Wade check his pocket watch and signal to Reed, a predetermined time marker for whatever plan the colonel had set in motion. Eleanor recognized the moment for what it was, the last peaceful exchange before the Diamondback gang revealed their true intentions. The colonel would soon drop his gentlemanly facade, and the real confrontation would begin. But Eleanor Blackwood had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, trained by one of the most dangerous men ever to ride the Western Territories. As she smiled pleasantly at her deadly visitors, appearing completely unaware of the danger coiling around her, Eleanor made her final mental preparations. Let them think her oblivious. Let them believe her helplessness. The herbs in their coffee were already working. Her weapons were positioned strategically throughout the house. And most importantly, the Diamondback gang remained completely unaware that they weren't facing a simple rancher's daughter, but the carefully crafted weapon of Thomas, the Ghost, Blackwood, the most lethal tracker in the Western Territories. More. Coffee, Colonel Harrington? Eleanor asked, rising gracefully from her chair, the perfect picture of frontier hospitality. The colonel's grey eyes tracked her movement with the focused intensity of a predator, though the herbs in his system had dulled the sharpness of his gaze. No, thank you, Miss Blackwood. I believe it's time we dispensed with the pleasantries. Eleanor affected a look of innocent confusion, even as she positioned herself strategically near the sideboard, where a loaded derringer lay hidden beneath a doily. I don't understand, sir. Have I offended you? The colonel's scarred face twisted into something approximating a smile. Not at all. You've been the perfect hostess. But we both know this isn't a social call. He gestured to Michael Denton, who moved to the window and signaled Wade and Reed to approach the house. Eleanor noted the slight unsteadiness in Michael's movements, the special coffee affecting his coordination already. Your reputation for directness precedes you, Colonel, Eleanor replied, deliberately using his military title. Perhaps you might explain your true purpose at Shadow Creek? The colonel studied her for a moment, his expression calculating despite the slight glassiness in his eyes. Very well. We're looking for something that belongs to us, something we believe your father has kept hidden for quite some time. Eleanor allowed her brow to furrow in apparent bewilderment. I'm afraid I don't follow. What could Pa possibly, if that would interest gentlemen like yourselves? The front door opened as Wade and Reed entered, completing the gang's assembly in the parlor. Wade's hand rested casually on his holstered Colt, while Reed's nervous gaze darted around the room, cataloguing potential threats and exits. Documents, the colonel stated flatly. Military documents from '66, records of Confederate gold shipments that never reached their intended destinations, maps of cache locations across 3 territories. Eleanor's surprise was genuine, though not for the reasons the colonel might assume. Her father had indeed maintained a hidden archive of sensitive documents, papers he reviewed periodically before resealing in waterproof containers buried beneath the stone floor of the root cellar. But Eleanor had always believed they related to his work tracking fugitives and deserters, not Confederate treasures. I believe you're mistaken, she said carefully. My father was a Union scout. Why would he possess Confederate documents? The colonel's laugh held no humor. Because, Miss Blackwood, before your father became the renowned tracker Thomas Blackwood, he was Captain Thomas Blackburn of Army Intelligence, tasked with recovering millions in Confederate assets after the war, assets that mysteriously disappeared while under his supervision. The revelation landed like a physical blow, but Eleanor maintained her composure, allowing only a flicker of shock to cross her features, exactly what would be expected from a Daughter learning unsettling news about her father. That's absurd, she protested, her voice appropriately indignant. My father is an honorable man. Your father, the colonel countered, is a thief and a traitor who betrayed both sides during the conflict. He stole gold intended to fund the rebuilding of the South, gold that rightfully belongs to the families whose fortunes were destroyed by northern aggression. Eleanor's mind worked furiously, reassessing everything she knew about Thomas Blackwood. In light of this accusation, the unexplained wealth that had purchased Shadow Creek when land prices were at their lowest, the mysterious visitors who sometimes arrived after midnight, the coded telegrams from Washington and Richmond, the combat skills far exceed those of an ordinary scout. I don't believe you, she stated firmly, playing for time while she adjusted to this new information. And even if such documents existed, I would have no knowledge of them. The colonel sighed, an expression of regret crossing his scarred features. I was afraid you might say that. Mr. Wade, perhaps you could help Miss Blackwood recall any unusual hiding places on the property. Wade stepped forward, removing leather gloves to reveal scarred knuckles. Be a pleasure, Colonel. There's no need for that, Eleanor said quickly, allowing fear to enter her voice. I'll show you Pa's study. If such papers exist, they'd be there. The colonel nodded approvingly. Sensible decision, Miss Blackwood. Lead the way. Eleanor turned toward the hallway, careful to maintain her appearance of nervous cooperation while mentally mapping the positions of all 5 men. The herbs would be working more strongly now, slowing their reactions, dulling their tactical awareness. The colonel, Wade, and Ethan Denton seemed to be fighting the effects through sheer discipline, but Michael Denton's eyes had grown noticeably unfocused, and Reed was blinking rapidly as though struggling to maintain alertness. Pa keeps his important papers in the desk, Eleanor explained as they entered Thomas Blackwood's study, a wood-paneled room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive oak desk. Maps of the territory covered one wall, cattle ledgers another. The colonel surveyed the room with a professional eye. Impressive for a simple rancher, custom woodwork, imported books, paintings that appeared to be original Remingtons. His gaze returned to Eleanor. Your father has done well for himself. 20 years of hard work, Eleanor replied defensively. Or 20 years of living off stolen Confederate gold, Wade countered, moving to examine the desk. The colonel positioned himself by the door, maintaining clear sightlines to both Eleanor and the hallway. Mr. Denton, keep watch outside. Mr. Reed, examine the bookshelves. Look for anything that might serve as a safe or hidden compartment. As the men began searching, Eleanor maintained her position near the window, her posture suggesting helpless compliance, while her mind calculated angles and distances. The grandfather clock in the corner showed 2:15. The ranch hands wouldn't return for at least 3 more days, and Sheriff Hayes rarely patrolled this far east unless specifically called. Whatever happened here, Eleanor would face it alone. Nothing in the desk, Wade reported after breaking open several locked drawers. Just ranch accounts and correspondence. Reed, nervously pulling books from shelves, shook his head. Nothing hidden behind these either, Colonel. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor's face. Miss Blackwood, your continued obstruction only makes this more difficult for everyone. Where would your father hide valuables? Eleanor allowed her gaze to flicker briefly toward the corner china cabinet, a calculated tell that the colonel immediately noticed. Mr. Wade, check that cabinet. Wade moved to the ornate piece of furniture, yanking open its doors and rifling. Through the contents, he extracted a small metal box from behind a stack of plates. Got something, Colonel. The colonel nodded for Wade to bring him the box. It was locked, but a quick application of Wade's knife to the hinges revealed its contents. Several gold double eagles, a small stack of government bonds, and a worn leather pouch containing uncut diamonds. Emergency funds, the colonel noted, examining a diamond against the light. Prudent, but hardly what we're looking for. His cold gaze returned to Eleanor. "Where are the documents, Miss Blackwood?" Eleanor's hesitation was perfectly calibrated, long enough to suggest genuine uncertainty, brief enough to appear cooperative. "There's a hidden compartment beneath the study floorboards, behind the desk." The colonel gestured for Wade and Reed to move the heavy desk. Eleanor noted how Reed stumbled slightly during the effort, the drugged coffee affecting his coordination. Even Wade's movement seemed fractionally slower than before. Beneath the desk, a section of floorboard had been cut and fitted with nearly invisible hinges. Wade pried it open to reveal a shallow space containing an oilskin package. "This is it," the colonel said with satisfaction as he examined the contents: yellowed maps, military orders bearing official seals, and a small red leather book filled with columns of numbers and coordinates. "Your father's insurance policy, documentation of every cash location and transaction record." He tucked the papers inside his coat. "Miss Blackwood, it appears we'll be requiring your hospitality a bit longer." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. "Your father will be returning eventually," the colonel explained. "I have certain questions only he can answer. Until then, you'll be our guest." "Hostage, you mean?" Eleanor corrected, allowing defiance to color her voice. The colonel inclined his head slightly. "A temporary necessity, I assure you. No harm will come to you if your father cooperates." "And if he doesn't?" The colonel's expression revealed nothing. "Thomas Blackwood, or Blackburn as I knew him, is a pragmatist. He'll make the sensible choice when presented with appropriate motivation." Eleanor recognized the implicit threat, but maintained her facade of frightened compliance. "What happens now?" "Now, Miss Blackwood, you will provide us with a tour of your lovely home, highlighting any other hiding places your father might have established. Then you'll assist us in making Shadow Creek comfortable for an extended visit." The colonel's scarred face formed a smile that never reached his eyes. "Consider us your guests until your father returns." Eleanor nodded meekly. "As you wish, Colonel." The next hour unfolded as an elaborate performance. Eleanor led the Diamondback gang through Shadow Creek Ranch, revealing minor hiding places while keeping the most significant ones secret. She showed them the concealed gun cabinet behind the kitchen pantry, the small safe beneath the parlor floorboards, and the escape tunnel that led from the main house to the barn, all features the colonel seemed to expect in the home of a former intelligence operative. What she didn't reveal was the root cellar's reinforced chamber, the secondary tunnel system that provided multiple escape routes, or the telegraph key that could summon help from the territorial marshal's office. Most importantly, she maintained her persona of a frightened young woman far out of her depth, cooperating only to ensure her safety. Throughout the tour, Eleanor noted with satisfaction how the drugged coffee continued to affect the gang members. Michael Denton had developed a noticeable tremor in his damaged hand. Reed's eyes had trouble focusing, particularly in transitions between outdoor light and indoor shadow. Even the disciplined colonel occasionally lost his train of thought mid-sentence, covering the lapse with a cough or strategic pause. Only Wade seemed to be fighting the effect successfully, his suspicious gaze following Eleanor's every movement. "She's playing us, Colonel," he muttered as they examined the barn. "Girl knows more than she's saying." The colonel silenced him with a sharp gesture. "Miss Blackwood is being admirably cooperative considering the circumstances, Mr. Wade. Your paranoia does you credit, but is unnecessary in this situation." Eleanor pretended not to hear this exchange as she demonstrated the barn's normal features. "Pa keeps the best horses in these stalls," she explained, pointing to where Mercury and the other prime mounts were kept. "The tack room is through that door, and feed storage is in the loft." As the tour concluded, the colonel issued orders for securing the property. "Mr. Reed will maintain watch from the windmill platform. Denton's establish a perimeter and check for any approaching riders. Mr. Wade, Secure our mounts and supplies." He turned to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, I believe it's approaching dinner time. Perhaps you might demonstrate more of your domestic skills." Eleanor recognized the strategy: keep her occupied with familiar tasks while they established control. Of Shadow Creek, it suited her purposes perfectly. The kitchen provided access to additional herbs that could further incapacitate her captors, and the colonel's division of his forces created vulnerabilities she could exploit. "Of course, Colonel," she replied with appropriate resignation. "Though, I should warn you, my cooking doesn't match my coffee." This earned a genuine chuckle from Reed, quickly silenced by the colonel's sharp glance. In the kitchen, Eleanor began preparing a meal, her movements deliberately domestic while her mind calculated and planned. The initial phase of her strategy had succeeded. The Diamondback gang had revealed their purpose, consumed drugged coffee that would increasingly impair their function, and divided their forces as they secured the property. Now came the more dangerous phase. The colonel clearly intended to wait for Thomas Blackwood's return, using Eleanor as leverage. That might mean days of maintaining her facade while looking for opportunities to turn the situation to her advantage. The extended timeline worked, both for and against her. It gave the herbs in their system more time to affect their judgment, but it also increased the risk of discovery if she made a misstep. As Eleanor chopped vegetables for stew, she observed Reed through the kitchen window, clumsily climbing the windmill ladder to establish his lookout position. His movements were increasingly uncoordinated, suggesting the drugged coffee had significantly impaired his motor skills. One potential threat was neutralized without a single shot fired. The Denton brothers had disappeared toward the creek to check the property boundaries, separating themselves from the main group. Another advantage Eleanor noted for future use. Only Wade and the colonel remained in the immediate vicinity, Wade tending the horses while the colonel reviewed the documents taken from the hidden compartment. Eleanor added a generous portion of sleeping herbs to the stew, knowing that the savory flavor would mask their bitter undertaste. Unlike the coffee, which had been designed to gradually impair function while leaving victims alert, this mixture would induce deep sleep within an hour of consumption. The effect wouldn't be subtle, but by the time they realized something was wrong, it would be too late. As the stew simmered, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of reflection. The colonel's revelations about her father had been unexpected, forcing her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about Thomas Blackwood. Had he truly stolen Confederate gold? Was Shadow Creek Ranch built on misappropriated funds? Were the skills he'd taught her, skills she'd believed were those of a frontier scout and tracker, actually the techniques of a military intelligence operative? The questions unsettled her, but Eleanor pushed them aside. Whatever the truth about her father's past, her immediate situation remained unchanged. 5 dangerous men had invaded her home, threatened her life, and intended to use her as leverage against her father. Dealing with that threat took precedence over moral calculations about Thomas Blackwood's history. "Something smells appetizing," the colonel remarked, appearing in the kitchen doorway. He'd removed his coat in the afternoon heat, revealing a shoulder holster containing a Remington revolver. "Your domestic skills are impressive for one so young." Eleanor glanced up from stirring the stew, allowing herself to startle slightly, as though surprised by his presence. "My mother's influence." She believed a lady should excel in household management regardless of circumstances. "Wise woman." The colonel leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but his eyes alert, despite the slight glassiness from the drugged coffee. "Tell me, Miss Blackwood, did your father ever speak of his time in Richmond during the final days of the war?" Eleanor shook her head, maintaining her pretense of ignorance. "Pa rarely speaks of the war years. Says some memories are best left buried." Indeed, the colonel's scarred face revealed nothing. And yet those buried things have a way of resurfacing, much like buried treasure. Eleanor kept her expression neutral as she ladled stew into bowls. "Dinner's ready. Should I call your men?" "Mr. Wade. We'll summon them." The colonel moved to the window, gesturing to Wade in the yard. "Your cooperation has been commendable, Miss Blackwood. I hope it continues when your father returns." Eleanor set the table with deliberate care, placing the drugged stew in 5 identical bowls, while keeping a 6th portion separate on the stove for herself. "You seem very certain he'll return soon." "Oh, I am." The colonel's smile held no warmth. "Because Thomas Blackburn is already on his way back to Shadow Creek Ranch, has been since yesterday." Eleanor nearly dropped the ladle, genuine shock breaking through her composed facade. "What? How could you possibly know that?" The colonel's expression was triumphant. "Because, Miss Blackwood, your father wasn't tracking strays these past 3 days. He was tracking us." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. If the colonel was right, if Thomas Blackwood had been following the Diamondback gang rather than searching for stray cattle, then everything changed. Her father wasn't an oblivious rancher who would walk into a trap upon his return. He was an experienced operative who knew exactly what awaited at Shadow Creek. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her confusion now entirely genuine. The colonel's chuckle held genuine amusement. "Your father has been shadowing our movement since the Prescott bank job. Did you truly believe Thomas, the ghost Blackburn, wouldn't notice when the Diamondback gang entered his territory?" He shook his head. "We've been playing a game of cat and mouse for days. The difference is, I know exactly where he'll eventually return to." Eleanor struggled to process this information. If her father had been tracking the Diamondbacks, why hadn't he warned her? Why leave her seemingly defenseless at Shadow Creek, unless he'd expected her to handle the situation herself? Unless all those years of training hadn't simply been a father's overprotective precautions, but preparation for exactly this scenario. The realization must have shown on her face, because the colonel's expression sharpened with sudden suspicion. "Is there something you wish to share, Miss Blackwood?" Before Eleanor could respond, Wade entered the kitchen, followed by Reed and the Denton brothers. All 4 men looked trail-worn and hungry, their attention immediately drawn to the steaming bowls on the table. "Smells mighty fine, Miss Blackwood," Reed commented, removing his hat. The young man's pupils were noticeably dilated from the coffees. "Herbs," his movements slightly uncoordinated. "Please help yourselves," Eleanor invited, gesturing to the table. "There's fresh bread as well." As the men seated themselves, Eleanor moved to fetch water from the pump, using the moment to compose herself. The colonel's revelation changed everything. If Thomas Blackwood knew about the Diamondback gang, if he'd been tracking them deliberately, then his absence from Shadow Creek wasn't coincidence, but strategy. Eleanor returned with the water pitcher, serving each man with perfect frontier hospitality. The colonel watched her with renewed interest, his earlier certainty now tinged with doubt. "You've gone quiet, Miss Blackwood," he observed, as she took her seat at the far end of the table. "Contemplating your father's imminent return, perhaps?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Actually, Colonel, I was wondering what my father might have taught me that I've yet to fully appreciate." Something in her tone caused Wade to pause with his spoon halfway to his mouth, sudden suspicion dawning in his eyes. "Colonel!" But the colonel had already taken several bites of the drugged stew, as had the other gang members. "Excellent fare, Miss Blackwood," he commented, apparently dismissing his momentary concern. "Your mother taught you well indeed." Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement, carefully eating from her own untainted portion. "A daughter can only hope to live up to her parents' expectations, Colonel Harrington." The conversation continued through dinner, a complex dance of implied threats and calculated responses. Eleanor noted with satisfaction how Reed's eyelids grew increasingly heavy, how Michael Denton struggled to maintain his focus, and how even the disciplined Ethan Denton began to slur his words slightly. Only the Colonel and Wade seemed to be fighting the effects successfully. Though both men blinked more frequently than normal, their reactions fractionally delayed. The combination of drugged coffee earlier and the sleeping herbs in the stew was taking its cumulative toll. "I believe we've imposed on Miss Blackwood's hospitality enough for one meal," the Colonel finally announced, pushing away his half-finished bowl. His gaze settled on Eleanor with renewed sharpness. "Perhaps you might show us to suitable accommodations for the night while we await your father's return." Eleanor recognized the caution in his voice. The Colonel hadn't survived this long without developing instincts for danger, and something, perhaps her too steady gaze, perhaps the unnatural heaviness in his own limbs, had triggered his suspicion. "Of course," she replied, rising from her chair with deliberate grace. "The guest rooms are upstairs, though I'm afraid we have only 3 prepared beds. Some of your men might need to make do with the parlor furniture." The Colonel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mr. Reed, you'll take your first watch from the windmill platform. Denton's, secure the barn and outbuildings. Mr. Wade, you'll remain with Miss Blackwood and myself in the main house." Eleanor noted how he'd positioned his most alert man, Wade, to guard her directly, while assigning the more affected gang members to perimeter duties where their impairment would matter less. A sound, tactical decision that confirmed the Colonel's dangerous competence even while drugged. As Reed and the Dentons departed to their assignments, Eleanor led the Colonel and Wade upstairs to the guest rooms. The house felt unnaturally quiet. The tension palpable as predator and prey assessed each other with new understanding. "This room should suit you, Colonel." Eleanor indicated the larger guest bedroom. "Mr. Wade can take the smaller room across the hall." The Colonel examined the room with professional thoroughness, despite his increasingly sluggish movements, checking sightlines from windows, testing the sturdiness of the door, inspecting the closet and under the bed. "Where will you be sleeping, Miss Blackwood?" he inquired, his tone falsely casual. "My room is at the end of the hall," Eleanor replied, keeping her expression neutral, "though I doubt I'll sleep much under the circumstances." Indeed. The Colonel removed his gun belt, hanging it within easy reach of the bed, a precaution that would prove useless once the sleeping herbs took full effect. "Mr. Wade will check on you periodically through the night, for your safety, of course." "Of course," Eleanor echoed, her tone appropriately bitter. As she turned to leave, the Colonel's voice stopped her at the threshold. "One last question, Miss Blackwood. That coffee you served earlier, was there something unusual about it?" Eleanor allowed herself to stiffen slightly, as though caught in a lie, before turning back with wide-eyed innocence. "Just my mother's. Special blend, Colonel. Is something wrong?" The Colonel studied her face for a long moment, suspicion warring with the increasing heaviness of his drugged system. "Nothing at all. Good night, Miss Blackwood." "Good night, Colonel," Eleanor replied softly, closing the door behind her. In the hallway, Wade watched her with undisguised hostility, his hand resting on his holstered Colt. "Don't try anything foolish, girl. I'll be watching." Eleanor adopted an expression of tired resignation. "I'm going to my room, Mr. Wade. I suggest you get some rest as well. Tomorrow promises to be eventful." As she closed her bedroom door, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Phase 2 of her plan had succeeded. The Diamondback gang was now scattered throughout the property, most of them significantly impaired by the combination of drugged coffee and sleeping herbs in the stew. Within an hour, even the vigilant Wade would be struggling to remain conscious. And when darkness fully claimed Shadow Creek Ranch, Eleanor Blackwood would begin hunting the men who had dared to threaten her home, one by one, in silence and shadow, just as her father had taught her. Moonlight spilled through the curtains of Eleanor's bedroom as she waited, counting minutes with patient precision. The grandfather clock downstairs had struck 10, then 11. The house had grown increasingly quiet as the sleeping herbs took effect throughout the Diamondback gang. Through the floorboards, Eleanor detected the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the colonel in the guest room below, the slow cadence of drug-induced sleep. From the hallway came the occasional footstep as Wade fought against the herbs, stubbornly maintaining his patrol despite his increasingly unsteady gait. Eleanor sat, perfectly still on the edge of her bed, fully dressed in dark trousers and a charcoal shirt that would blend with the shadows. She'd removed her boots, leaving them arranged near the door, where Wade would see them if he checked her room. Her stockinged feet would move silently across the wooden floors. At precisely 11:30, Eleanor heard what she'd been waiting for. Wade's footsteps pausing outside her door, followed by the soft click of the latch as he peered inside to confirm her presence. Eleanor remained motionless in the bed, a carefully arranged shape beneath blankets, her honey-blonde hair visible on the pillow. Wade observed for a moment, then closed the door with a satisfied grunt. 5 minutes later, the unmistakable sound of a body slumping against the wall told Eleanor that Wade had finally succumbed to the herbs. She moved silently to the door, opening it to find the gunman sprawled in the hallway, his revolver still clutched in his hand, eyes closed in deep sleep. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Wade," Eleanor whispered, carefully extracting the Colt from his fingers and removing the ammunition from his pockets. With practiced efficiency, Eleanor secured Wade with strips torn from a bedsheet, binding his hands and feet and gagging him to prevent any alarm if he woke prematurely. She dragged his unconscious form into the linen closet, propping him upright in a seated position to prevent choking, then locked the door from the outside. 1 down, 4 to go. Eleanor moved silently down the hallway to the colonel's room. The door was ajar, a tactical choice that would allow him to hear any disturbance in the house. Now it would work against him. She peered inside to confirm he was indeed unconscious, his scarred face slack in sleep, one hand still reaching toward the gun belt hanging from the bedpost. Rather than enter the room and risk waking him, Eleanor simply closed the door and locked it from the outside with the skeleton key she kept hidden in a hallway sconce. The colonel was temporarily contained. She would deal with him last, after neutralizing the remaining gang members. Moving downstairs, Eleanor retrieved her father's modified Winchester rifle from its hiding place behind the false back of the gun cabinet. The weapon had been customized for accuracy and silence, with a special wire-wrapped barrel that reduced the report to little more than a sharp exhalation. One of many modifications Thomas Blackwood had acquired through his mysterious connections. She checked the action, loaded the specialized ammunition her father had handcrafted, and slung the rifle across her back. Next came a Bowie knife in a leather sheath at her hip, the matched Remington revolvers in custom holsters, and several smaller weapons concealed throughout her clothing. In the kitchen, Eleanor paused to consume a mixture of herbs from a jar. Her father kept labeled simply "Focus," a bitter concoction that sharpened senses and accelerated reaction time for several hours. The taste was foul, but the effects would prove invaluable in the coming confrontation. As the stimulant herbs began to take effect, Eleanor's awareness expanded. The subtle creaking of the house timbers, the distant hoot of a hunting owl, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, all registered with crystalline clarity. Her pupils dilated, adjusting to gather maximum light, while her muscles hummed with controlled energy. She moved to the gun cabinet and rotated a seemingly decorative carving on its frame. A soft click signaled the release of a hidden compartment in the base, revealing a worn leather journal, Thomas Blackwood's private record, written in a cipher known only to him and Eleanor. She'd never fully understood why her father insisted she memorize the complex substitution code, but now its purpose seemed clear. Eleanor flipped through the journal to recent entries, scanning her father's precise handwriting. April 17th, 1885. Diamondback Gang reported operating near Flagstaff. J.H. confirmed as leader, will investigate connection to Richmond incident. April 23rd, 1885. Bank at Prescott likely target. Placed a warning with the Marshal's office. Preparations at Shadow Creek upgraded. April 28th, 1885. Prescott hit. 2 casualties. J.H. moving as predicted. Will intercept along Silverbow route. He prepared per contingency Delta. Eleanor stared at the final entry with growing comprehension. Her father had known the Diamondbacks were coming, had deliberately tracked them toward Shadow Creek, had left her alone not through carelessness, but because he'd been implementing a larger strategy, contingency Delta. The phrase triggered a cascade of memories, training scenarios her father had drilled into her since childhood. Delta specifically referred to the protocol for handling hostile forces occupying Shadow Creek Ranch, while Thomas was absent. A protocol that placed Eleanor as the primary defensive asset rather than a victim to be protected. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He'd deployed her. With this realization, Eleanor's perception of the situation transformed. She wasn't improvising a defense against unexpected invaders. She was executing a carefully pre-planned operation with clearly defined objectives: neutralize the threat, secure key assets, and prepare for her father's arrival. Eleanor returned the journal to its hiding place and moved toward the kitchen's root cellar entrance. If she was implementing contingency Delta, she would need additional resources. The root cellar's earthen steps led downward into darkness, but Eleanor navigated them with confident familiarity. At the bottom, she located the disguised lever that opened the reinforced chamber her father had constructed beneath the main storage area. Inside, illuminated by a single oil lamp she carefully lit, lay the true arsenal of Shadow Creek Ranch. Weapons racks contained rifles, shotguns, and pistols of various designs, many modified with specialized features. Ammunition crates held standard and custom loads. One wall displayed an array of non-firearm weapons, throwing knives, garrots, blowguns with dart sets, and devices Eleanor had never seen used beyond practice sessions. But it was the cabinet along the rear wall that drew Eleanor's attention. Inside lay the specialized equipment Thomas Blackwood had accumulated during his years as the Ghost. Tools for tracking, surveillance, and, if necessary, elimination. Eleanor selected several items with deliberate care. Flash charges that would temporarily blind without causing permanent damage, smoke canisters that would create confusion and cover, specialized ammunition designed to incapacitate rather than kill, and a small crossbow with paralytic-tipped bolts. Her father's voice seemed to echo in the chamber as she made her selections. A weapon is just a tool, Ellie girl. Choose the right tool for each task. Sometimes that means lethal force, but when possible, preserve life. Dead men tell no tales, but living prisoners provide valuable intelligence. Eleanor had never fully understood the context of these lessons until now. Thomas Blackwood hadn't been preparing her for the occasional hostile encounter on the frontier. He'd been training her as an operative in whatever shadowy conflict he'd been fighting since the war. As she gathered her equipment, Eleanor's mind returned to the colonel's accusations. Had her father truly stolen Confederate gold? Was Shadow Creek Ranch built with misappropriated funds? The questions troubled her, but Eleanor compartmentalized her doubts. Personal reckoning would come later, after she'd secured the ranch and neutralized the Diamondback threat. With her preparations complete, Eleanor extinguished the lamp and ascended from the root cellar. The kitchen clock showed midnight, optimal timing for what came next. Human alertness naturally diminished between midnight and 4 a.m., even without drugged stew to accelerate the process. Eleanor moved toward the rear door, pausing to review her mental map of the property and the Diamondback Gang's positions. Reed had been assigned the windmill platform as a lookout post, but given his condition when last seen, he'd likely succumbed to the sleeping herbs hours ago. The Denton brothers had been tasked with securing the barn and outbuildings. They'd either established a patrol pattern or selected defensive positions to spend the night. The Colonel and Wade were temporarily contained within the house. Wade locked in the linen closet, the Colonel in the guest bedroom. Both would eventually free themselves, but not before Eleanor had dealt with the remaining gang members. She slipped outside, moving across the yard in a low crouch, using the shadows cast by outbuildings and equipment to mask her approach toward the windmill. The night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the vast Arizona sky like diamond dust. A quarter moon provided just enough illumination to navigate without revealing her presence to casual observation. Eleanor reached the base of the windmill and paused, listening. From the platform 40 feet above came the unmistakable sound of snoring. Reed had indeed succumbed to the herbs. She began climbing, careful to distribute her weight evenly to prevent the structure from creaking. At the top, she found Reed slumped against the platform railing, his rifle lying forgotten across his lap, hat pulled low over his closed eyes. The young man's breathing was deep and regular, face relaxed in sleep, making him appear even younger than before, barely more than a boy playing at being an outlaw. Eleanor secured his weapons without waking him, then bound him with rope from her belt. Only when he was fully restrained did she gently shake his shoulder. "Mr. Reed," she whispered. "Calvin, wake up." Reed's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to alarm as he registered his bound condition and Eleanor's transformed appearance. Gone was the frightened rancher's daughter. In her place stood a confident operator with weapons and purpose. "Miss Blackwood," he slurred, the herbs still affecting his speech. "What's happening? I don't—" "Shh." Eleanor pressed a finger to her lips. "Speak quietly. I have questions and you're going to provide answers." Reed blinked rapidly, struggling to process the situation. "The Colonel is currently indisposed," Eleanor finished for him, "as is Mr. Wade. You're alone, Calvin, and I'm offering you a choice that the others won't receive." What choice? Fear sharpened the young man's features, cutting through some of his drug-induced haze. Eleanor studied him assessingly. "You're new to the Diamondback gang. The Colonel's journal describes you as the stable boy from Virginia. You haven't fully embraced their methods yet, have you?" Reed swallowed hard. "I just needed work. After the war, there wasn't anything left of my family's place. The Colonel said he needed someone who knew horses." "Did he tell you about the men who died in Prescott? The bank clerk with 3 children? The guard who'd saved for years to buy his mother a proper house?" Shame crossed Reed's youthful features. "I didn't fire any shots. I just held the horses." "But you're still riding with killers," Eleanor pointed out softly, "still taking your share of stolen money." Reed's eyes dropped. "Ain't had much choice once I joined up. The Colonel doesn't let people just walk away." Eleanor made a decision. "Calvin, I'm giving you an opportunity the others won't get. Tell me everything you know about the Colonel's plans, why he really came to Shadow Creek, what he intends to do with my father, everything, and I'll let you leave with your life. And a horse. And if I don't," Eleanor's expression hardened, "then you'll join Wade in confinement until the territorial marshal arrives to collect the Diamondback gang. The charges will include multiple murders, armed robbery, and kidnapping. The penalty for such crimes in Arizona territory is hanging." Reed's young face paled in the moonlight. "They'd hang me too, even though I didn't shoot anybody? The law doesn't make fine distinctions when it comes to outlaws, Calvin. You rode with them, you'll hang with them." The young man seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "What do you want to know?" For the next 20 minutes, Eleanor questioned Reed methodically, building a complete picture of the Diamondback gang's operations and the Colonel's true intentions. The young man's account confirmed much of what Eleanor had already surmised, while adding critical details about the Confederate gold shipments, Thomas Blackwood's alleged role in their disappearance, and the colonel's obsessive quest to recover what he viewed as rightfully his. The colonel was a treasury officer for the Confederacy, Reed explained. When Richmond fell, he was tasked with moving gold reserves south, millions in coins, bullion and diamonds. Your father was a Union intelligence officer who intercepted the shipments. Official records show the gold was turned over to the federal government, but the colonel claims most of it disappeared. He spent 20 years tracking it down, and he believes my father took it, Reed nodded. Says Captain Blackburn, your father, filed reports claiming much smaller amounts than were actually captured. Says he used the stolen gold to build himself a new life, while good Southern families starved. Why come after him now, after 20 years? The colonel finally found proof. Treasury documents that survived the Richmond fire, records of exactly what was transported. Plus some old Confederate officer recognized your father in Prescott last year. The colonel's been planning this ever since. Eleanor absorbed this information, mentally comparing it against what she knew of her father. Thomas Blackwood had always lived comfortably but modestly. Shadow Creek Ranch was valuable but had been purchased legitimately. There were no extravagant expenditures, no unexplained wealth. If her father had stolen Confederate gold, where was it? What does the colonel plan to do once my father returns? She asked. Reed's expression grew troubled. Force him to reveal where the gold is hidden. Colonel's got methods from the war. Says everyone breaks eventually. Torture, Eleanor translated flatly. Reed couldn't meet her eyes. And then? Once he has what he wants. The young man didn't need to finish. The implication was clear. Thomas Blackwood would not be permitted to survive the encounter. And me? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. Reed's silence was confirmation enough. Thank you for your honesty, Calvin. Eleanor reached for something in her pocket. I intend to keep my word about letting you leave, but not until this situation is resolved. You understand, I can't have you warning the others. Before Reed could respond, Eleanor pressed a cloth containing a powerful sleeping agent against his face. He struggled briefly, then slumped into unconsciousness. She arranged his bound form in a recovery position to ensure clear breathing, then secured him more thoroughly to the windmill platform with additional rope. Sleep well, she murmured. When you wake, your life will have taken a very different path. Descending the windmill, Eleanor paused at its base to reconsider her strategy based on Reed's information. The stakes had risen significantly. The colonel wasn't simply an outlaw seeking temporary shelter or random valuables. He was a man with a 20-year vendetta against Thomas Blackwood, armed with documented grievances and military training. Most concerning, he had detailed knowledge of her father's methods and thinking, having studied his adversary for 2 decades. This would require more than simple neutralization of threats. Eleanor needed to secure the documents the colonel had discovered in her father's study, determine what other evidence he might possess, and extract information about any additional Diamondback affiliates who might continue the vendetta if the colonel failed. She moved toward the barn, where the Denton brothers had been assigned to secure the perimeter. Given their condition when last seen, Eleanor expected to find them incapacitated by the drugged stew, but caution remained essential. Michael Denton, in particular, had demonstrated instability during dinner, his gaze lingering on Eleanor with disturbing intensity. The barn door stood slightly ajar, a lantern's glow visible through the gap. Eleanor approached from the side, using shadows for cover, and peered through a knothole in the wooden wall. Inside, Ethan Denton sat at a makeshift table, head propped on his hand, struggling to remain awake as he played solitaire with a worn deck of cards. His rifle leaned against the table within easy reach, though his drooping eyelids suggested he wouldn't be able to react quickly if threatened. Of Michael Denton, there was no sign. Eleanor scanned the visible portion of the barn interior, noting the usual arrangement of stalls, tack, and feed storage. The horses, both the Diamondback's mounts and Shadow Creek's own, shuffled quietly in their stalls, occasionally nickering softly. Nothing appeared disturbed or threatening, yet the absence of the younger Denton brother raised concerns. Eleanor circled the barn, checking other entrance points. The rear loading door remained securely fastened from inside. The hayloft window was closed. The small side door used for carrying feed and equipment showed no signs of recent use. Where was Michael Denton? A soft, scraping sound from the equipment shed adjacent to the barn answered her question. Eleanor moved silently toward the wooden structure, drawing one of her Remington revolvers. Through the shed's single window she observed Michael Denton, rummaging through farm tools, mumbling to himself as he examined and discarded various implements. His movements were uncoordinated, his speech slurred, clear evidence that the drugged stew continued to affect him. What wasn't clear was his purpose. Why separate from his brother? What was he seeking among the farm equipment? Eleanor circled to the shed's rear entrance, easing the door open just enough to hear Denton's muttered monologue. "Teach that uppity bitch. Thinks she's better'n us. Colonel won't mind once I'm done. Just need something to keep her quiet." A chill ran through Eleanor as comprehension dawned. Michael Denton, affected by the drugs and his own baser instincts, had slipped away from his assigned post to find tools for assaulting her. The length of rope he'd already set aside, alongside a filthy bandana, clearly intended as a gag, confirmed his vile intentions. Eleanor felt cold fury replace calculation. This threat wasn't merely tactical, it was predatory, personal, and required immediate neutralization. She chambered a specialized round in her Remington, a projectile her father had designed for incapacitation rather than lethality. The ammunition would expand upon impact, delivering a powerful blow that would render the target unconscious without causing permanent damage. She stepped into the doorway, leveling her weapon at Michael Denton's back. "Looking for something, Mr. Denton?" He whirled, nearly losing his balance in his drugged state. Recognition, then leering hostility crossed his features as he saw Eleanor silhouetted in the doorway. "Well now," he slurred, revealing rotted teeth in what he likely imagined was a charming smile. "Saved me the trouble of coming to find you, girl." "I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite her disgust. "Put down that rope and place your hands where I can see them." Denton's eyes narrowed as he registered the revolver aimed at his chest. Rather than complying, he lunged for a nearby pitchfork, raising it like a spear. "Uppity bitch," he snarled, advancing unsteadily. "Gonna teach you—" Eleanor fired. The specialized round struck Denton's shoulder with a dull thud. The impact, spinning him halfway around before he collapsed in an unconscious heap, the pitchfork clattering harmlessly beside him. "Lesson declined," Eleanor murmured, stepping forward to secure him with his own rope. Once Michael Denton was properly restrained, gagged, and secured to a support beam, Eleanor returned her attention to the barn. Ethan Denton remained at his makeshift table, now fully asleep, with his head resting on his folded arms, the playing cards scattered beneath him. His breathing was deep and regular. He'd be unconscious for hours, given the dose of sleeping herbs he'd consumed. Eleanor secured him efficiently, binding his hands and feet while he slept, then dragging both Denton brothers to an empty stall where they could be locked away from weapons or tools. She removed anything dangerous from their persons, confiscating knives, matches, and the small stick of dynamite Ethan carried in a specialized pocket of his vest. With 3 of the 5 Diamondback gang members now neutralized, Eleanor returned to the house to deal with Wade, and finally the Colonel himself. As she crossed the yard, a sense of grim satisfaction accompanied her. The men who had invaded her home, threatened her life, and planned to torture her father were being systematically removed from the equation, not by Thomas Blackwood's intervention, but through her own capabilities. The training, the preparations, the carefully concealed skills, all were now serving their intended purpose. Eleanor Blackwood was indeed her father's daughter, not merely in name, but in capability and resolve. As she reached the porch, Eleanor paused to consider her next steps. Wade, while dangerous, was securely confined in the linen closet and could wait. The colonel posed the greater threat, both immediate and long-term. His knowledge of Thomas Blackwood, his documented grievances, and his military background made him unpredictable even while impaired by drugged stew. Eleanor needed information only the colonel could provide: the extent of his evidence against her father, the existence of allies beyond the Diamondback gang, and most importantly, his true objective. Was recovering Confederate gold his sole motivation, or did his vendetta against Thomas Blackwood run deeper? To extract such information, Eleanor would need to confront the colonel directly, a dangerous proposition even with every advantage on her side. The man hadn't survived 20 years as an outlaw leader without developing formidable instincts and capabilities. She checked her weapons, ensuring each was loaded and accessible. She reviewed the house layout in her mind, focusing on defensive positions and potential escape routes. Finally, she withdrew a small vial from her pocket, another of her father's specialized concoctions, designed to temporarily heighten perception and reaction speed at the cost of later exhaustion. Eleanor swallowed the bitter liquid, feeling it burn down her throat and spread fire through her veins. Her vision sharpened, sounds became more distinct, and time seemed to slow fractionally as her nervous system accelerated. Now properly prepared, Eleanor Blackwood entered her home to confront the architect of the threat against her family. Not as a frightened rancher's daughter, but as the heir to Thomas the Ghost Blackwood's legacy of shadow operations and lethal capability. Eleanor entered the darkened house through the kitchen door, moving with liquid grace enhanced by her father's stimulant mixture. Her senses operated at peak efficiency, registering the subtle creaking of floorboards overhead, the scent of gun oil lingering from the Diamondback's weapons, even the minute temperature differences between rooms. The house felt different now. No longer a sanctuary invaded, but a battlefield she controlled. Every corner, every shadow, every creaking board was familiar territory to Eleanor, while remaining treacherous unknown ground to her adversaries. She paused at the base of the stairs, listening intently. Wade should still be secured in the linen closet, but the colonel's status remained uncertain. The lock on the guest bedroom door would hold against casual attempts to open it, but a man of the colonel's experience might have found alternative means of escape. Eleanor ascended the stairs silently, testing each step before committing her. Wait! Halfway up, she detected a faint metallic scraping from the direction of the linen closet, Wade working against his bonds, likely using some hidden implement to saw through the cloth restraints. The sound was rhythmic but unhurried, suggesting he'd only recently regained consciousness and didn't yet perceive immediate danger. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor paused again, surveying the hallway. The guest bedroom door remained closed, no light visible beneath it. The linen closet showed similar signs of containment. Everything appeared secure, yet Eleanor's instincts, honed by years of her father's training, sensed something amiss. She removed her boots, setting them silently on the hallway carpet, then drew both Remington revolvers. The specialized ammunition loaded in the right-hand weapon would incapacitate without killing. The standard rounds in the left would prove lethal if necessary. Eleanor preferred the former, but was prepared for the latter. Moving to the linen closet. First, she positioned herself at an angle that would provide cover if Wade managed to break free. The scraping sound continued, accompanied now by muffled grunts of effort. "Mr. Wade," Eleanor called softly, "I recommend you cease your current activity. Your companions have already been neutralized, and continuing resistance will only worsen your situation." The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by silence. Then Wade's voice, hoarse but defiant. "Blackwood's little girl thinks she's clever. Wait till the Colonel gets hold of you." "The Colonel is currently indisposed," Eleanor replied evenly. "And I'm offering you the same choice I gave Mr. Reed. Cooperation in exchange for leniency." Wade's harsh laugh carried through the door. "Reed was always weak. I ain't telling you nothing, girl." "As you wish." Eleanor checked that the restraints holding the door secure remained intact, then added, "Though you might be interested to know that the territorial marshal is already en route to Shadow Creek. The murder charges from Prescott alone will ensure hanging sentences for all Diamondback members." She detected a slight hitch in Wade's breathing, concern briefly overriding bravado. Leverage identified. Unless, of course, certain members provide valuable information that mitigates their personal culpability, Eleanor continued. "Mr. Reed, for instance, has already demonstrated considerable cooperation." "Reed doesn't know half of what the Colonel's planning," Wade sneered. Though uncertainty had entered his voice, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Then perhaps someone with greater knowledge would be more valuable to the prosecution. Someone whose testimony might spare them the noose in favor of merely extended incarceration." Silence from the closet, then. What sort of information would buy this? Leniency? Complete details of Diamondback operations, names of associates beyond your immediate group, specifics regarding the Colonel's objectives concerning Thomas Blackwood, evidence about the Confederate gold shipments. More silence as Wade considered his options. Eleanor waited patiently, keeping her senses attuned to any sound from the guest bedroom. The Colonel remained ominously quiet, either still unconscious from the drugged stew or implementing some strategy of his own. "I might know some things." Wade finally conceded, his tone suggesting reluctant calculation rather than genuine cooperation. "But I ain't talking through no door to someone who's trussed me up like a holiday turkey. And I'm not opening this door until I'm convinced of your sincerity, Mr. Wade." Eleanor kept her voice reasonable but firm. "Perhaps a demonstration of good faith? A piece of information I can verify before we continue this conversation face to face." Wade grunted in frustration, then offered, "The Colonel's got a man in the Territorial Marshal's office. Name's Phillips, Deputy Marshal out of Prescott. Been feeding him information for 2 years now." Eleanor processed this revelation with concern. If accurate, it meant the legitimate authorities might be compromised, potentially transforming any official response to the Shadow Creek situation into additional danger rather than rescue. "Useful information, Mr. Wade. Allow me to verify one more detail. What's the Colonel's actual objective regarding Confederate gold? Recovery for personal gain or something else?" Wade's laugh held a note of genuine amusement. "Girl, you really don't know anything, do you? This ain't about money, not primarily anyway. It's about justice, retribution. Your father didn't just steal Confederate gold. He betrayed everyone who trusted him. Union command, Confederate officials who surrendered the shipments, even his own men." "Explain," Eleanor demanded, a chill running through her despite the stimulant mixture warming her blood. "Your father was operating as a double agent during the final months of the war," Wade explained, warming to his subject as he sensed Eleanor's genuine interest. "Pretended to be sympathetic to the Confederate cause while working for Union intelligence. When Richmond fell, he was perfectly positioned to intercept the Treasury shipments because both sides trusted him. The Colonel was one of the Confederate officers who personally handed over gold caches to Captain Blackburn, believing he was delivering them to secure Southern locations." Eleanor struggled to reconcile this information with the father she knew, a man of integrity who had raised her with clear moral principles. The official record shows my father turned those shipments over to Union authorities, she countered. Some of them, sure, the ones he couldn't disappear. But millions went missing, gold and diamonds that never reached any official repository, north or south. Your father reported ambushes, paperwork errors, miscounts, all cover for what he was skimming. And the colonel has proof of these allegations. 20 years' worth, Wade confirmed. Treasury documents, witness testimonies, shipping manifests. Enough to see your father hanged for treason against both sides if it ever reached proper authorities. Eleanor absorbed this information, analyzing its strategic implications while compartmentalizing the emotional impact. If Wade was telling the truth, and his detailed account suggested at least partial accuracy, the situation was far more complex than a simple conflict between outlaws and lawful citizens. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Wade," she said finally. "One last question. Does the colonel intend to turn my father over to authorities, or does he plan more direct retribution?" Wade's silence answered more clearly than words could have. "See?" Eleanor said softly. "In that case, Mr. Wade, I recommend you make yourself comfortable. Our conversation will continue after I've addressed more immediate concerns." She sensed Wade's renewed struggling against his bonds, but judged the restraint sufficient to hold him for now. The more pressing issue remained the colonel's conspicuous silence from the guest bedroom. Eleanor moved down the hallway, approaching the door with calculated caution. No sound emerged from within, no breathing, no movement, not even the subtle shifts that typically accompany deep sleep. The stillness felt deliberate rather than natural. She pressed her ear against the wood, using her enhanced senses to detect any disruption in the air currents that might suggest movement inside. Nothing. Either the colonel remained deeply unconscious, or he had already escaped. Eleanor tried the key in the lock, turning it silently. The mechanism clicked, but when she tested the handle, the door remained firmly closed, blocked from inside. Confirmation. The colonel was awake and had barricaded himself in preparation for confrontation. "Colonel Harrington," Eleanor called through the door, "I believe it's time we spoke directly." For a moment silence continued. Then the colonel's voice, remarkably clear despite the drugged stew, responded, "Indeed, Miss Blackwood, though I suspect we're no longer operating under the pretense that you're merely a rancher's daughter, are we? Just as you're not simply a former Confederate officer," Eleanor countered. "Shall we dispense with the pretenses entirely?" A refreshing suggestion. The sound of furniture being moved preceded the colonel's next words. "I'm going to open this door. I'm unarmed and will remain visible in the center of the room. I expect similar courtesy from you." Eleanor stepped back, positioning herself at an angle that provided both visibility and tactical advantage. "Agreed, though I will retain my weapons given the circumstances." The door opened slowly to reveal the colonel standing in the center of the guest bedroom, hands raised to shoulder height, palms forward. He'd removed his outer clothing, standing in shirt sleeves and trousers that clearly couldn't conceal weapons. His expression showed strain from fighting the drugged stew's effects, but his eyes remained alert and calculating. "Impressive work. Miss Blackwood," he acknowledged, taking in her transformed appearance and the revolvers held competently in her hands. "The coffee and stew are both drugged, I presume? Professional grade work. Your father taught you well." "Where are my men?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Secured," Eleanor replied simply. "Mr. Reed and the Denton brothers are restrained in the barn. Mr. Wade is contained nearby, though considerably more talkative than when you last saw him." Something flickered in the colonel's scarred features, not concern for his men, but calculation regarding what information Wade might have revealed. "I see. And now you and I are to have a civilized conversation while you decide my fate." A hint of amusement colored his tone. "Your father's methods, through and through. He always did prefer negotiation to immediate violence when information was at stake. Eleanor maintained her distance, revolvers unwavering. You seem to know a great deal about Thomas Blackwood. I should. I've dedicated 20 years to understanding the man who betrayed me. The colonel's voice remained conversational, but undercurrents of deep hatred flowed beneath the superficial calm. Just as he clearly spent 20 years preparing you to defend his interests in his absence. These interests being Confederate gold shipments you believe he misappropriated? The colonel's eyebrows rose fractionally. Wade has been forthcoming indeed. Yes, Miss Blackwood. Gold shipments entrusted to your father's care that subsequently vanished, approximately $12 million worth in 1865 currency, considerably more in today's valuation. Eleanor kept her expression neutral despite her shock at the figure. Such wealth was almost beyond comprehension, enough to purchase half the territory if liquidated carefully. And you believe this fortune is hidden at Shadow Creek Ranch? The colonel smiled thinly. No, Miss Blackwood. If it were that simple, I would have simply purchased adjacent properties and conducted methodical searches years ago. The gold isn't here, at least not primarily, but the documentation revealing its locations is. Specifically, the cipher key that would unlock the meaning of these. He gestured toward his discarded coat, where the leather portfolio taken from Thomas Blackwood's study remained visible. The documents you discovered earlier are encoded, Eleanor surmised. Precisely. Your father was nothing if not thorough in his precautions. The ledger contains locations, but they're expressed in a substitution cipher whose key exists separately. 20 years of work, and I've only managed to decode fragments through pattern analysis. Eleanor absorbed this information, reassessing what she knew of her father's activities. The frequent rides to check remote sections of Shadow Creek property, the mysterious trips to territorial banks in Prescott and Tucson, the careful attention to seemingly arbitrary landmarks throughout the region. Why reveal this to me now? She asked, sensing the colonel was building towards some proposition. Because, Miss Blackwood, we've reached an inflection point. Your father is returning to Shadow Creek, aware of our presence. My men have been neutralized through your unexpected competence. Our carefully planned confrontation has transformed into something neither Tom nor I fully anticipated. The colonel's scarred face formed a smile that held genuine appreciation. You've changed the parameters of our decades-long game. This isn't a game, Eleanor countered sharply. You've threatened my home, endangered my life, and plan to torture my father for information. The colonel inclined his head in acknowledgement. From your perspective, entirely accurate. From mine, and perhaps from Thomas Blackwood's, it's the final move in a strategic conflict that began in the ashes of Richmond 20 years ago. His expression grew contemplative. Though I admit, your father's decision to place you at the center of this confrontation suggests a complexity to his planning that even I underestimated. A chill ran through Eleanor as she considered the implications. Had her father deliberately left her at Shadow Creek knowing the Diamondback gang would arrive? Had he anticipated not only that she could defend herself, but that she would successfully neutralize seasoned outlaws through the skills he'd instilled? What exactly are you proposing, Colonel? Eleanor kept her voice steady despite her growing unease. A renegotiation of terms, he replied simply. The original confrontation I envisioned, forcing your father to reveal the cipher key through whatever means necessary, has become impractical given current circumstances. However, our mutual interests might still be served through cooperation rather than conflict. I failed to see how our interests align in any capacity. The colonel's expression turned shrewd. Don't you? Consider what you've learned tonight, Miss Blackwood. Your father, the paragon of frontier virtue you've admired your entire life, built Shadow Creek Ranch with funds stolen from both North and South during the chaos of war's end. Every comfort you've enjoyed, every advantage you've received, has been purchased with misappropriated gold that rightfully belonged to others. Eleanor maintained her impassive expression, though the colonel's words struck uncomfortably close to doubts already forming in her mind. Furthermore, he continued, Thomas clearly raised you not merely as a daughter, but as an operative, training you in skills no frontier girl would ordinarily possess, preparing you for precisely this type of confrontation. He shaped you into a weapon, Miss Blackwood, without your knowledge or consent. You know nothing about my relationship with my father, Eleanor replied coldly. Perhaps not its emotional dimensions, the colonel conceded, but its practical aspects are evident in every move you've made tonight. The tactical thinking, the proportional application of force, the interrogation techniques. These aren't skills acquired through normal childhood development, Miss Blackwood. They're the result of methodical conditioning by someone with very specific intentions. The words landed with disturbing precision, articulating concerns Eleanor had occasionally harbored but never fully examined. Why had Thomas Blackwood insisted on such extensive training? Why the emphasis on weapons, tactics, and tradecraft that seemed excessive even for the dangerous frontier? What exactly are you suggesting? Eleanor kept her revolvers trained on the colonel, despite the unsettling direction of the conversation. Simply this: your father has used you, just as he used everyone else in his life. The Union commanders, who trusted him with sensitive operations, the Confederate officials who believed his sympathetic overtures, the men under his command who followed his orders unquestioningly. The colonel's voice remained measured, reasonable, and now his own daughter, positioned as a sacrificial piece in his decades-long effort to protect ill-gotten gains. You're attempting to turn me against my father, Eleanor observed, her tone flat. I'm offering perspective, Miss Blackwood, perspective that might lead to a more advantageous outcome for both of us. The colonel's scarred features arranged themselves into an expression of sincerity. Consider an alternative approach, one where you and I cooperate to locate the cipher key, decode the ledger, and recover the hidden assets. To what end? Equal division. 6 million to you, 6 million to me. Enough wealth to establish whatever life you might desire, independent of Thomas Blackwood's manipulations and deceptions. The colonel spread his hands. You needn't depend on a father who placed you in danger to protect his secrets. You could travel to Europe, establish yourself in San Francisco society, build charitable foundations, whatever ambitions you might harbor. The offer hung in the air between them, tempting in its simplicity. Eleanor maintained her outward composure while her mind analyzed the colonel's proposition from multiple angles. Was he sincere in offering partnership, or merely attempting to create division between Eleanor and her father? Did the cipher key actually exist at Shadow Creek, or was the colonel using this negotiation to buy time for some alternative strategy? Most importantly, how much truth lay in his characterization of Thomas Blackwood as manipulator and thief? Eleanor decided to probe further, seeking information while appearing to consider his offer. You've presented a compelling narrative, Colonel, but it relies entirely on your characterization of events that occurred before I was born. Why should I accept your version over my father's 20 years of demonstrated care and guidance? The colonel's expression suggested he'd anticipated this response. A fair question. I'm not asking you to take my word alone. He gestured toward his coat again. In the inner pocket, you'll find a packet of documents I've carried for 20 years, letters in your father's hand, written to Confederate officials, expressing Southern sympathies while he simultaneously filed reports to Union Command. Treasury receipts showing discrepancies between what was surrendered and what was reported. Witness statements from men who served under Captain Blackburn, describing unusual activities during gold transports. Eleanor hesitated, torn between maintaining complete control of the confrontation and satisfying her growing need to understand her father's true past. "You may examine them while keeping me covered," the colonel offered, correctly reading her dilemma. "I've nothing to gain by fabricating evidence at this stage." After a moment's consideration, Eleanor approached the coat, keeping one revolver trained on the colonel while using her free hand to extract the mentioned packet. The documents were clearly aged, the paper yellowed, the ink faded in places. She flipped through them quickly, unable to verify their authenticity, but recognizing her father's distinctive handwriting on several pages. "These could be forgeries," she noted, though doubt had crept into her voice. "They could," the colonel acknowledged, "but forging 20 years' worth of period-accurate documents, including official seals and signatures from dozens of individuals, would require resources far beyond those available to a frontier outlaw. The simpler explanation, Miss Blackwood, is that they're genuine." Eleanor returned the papers to the coat pocket, her mind working through implications and possibilities. If the colonel spoke truthfully, if Thomas Blackwood had indeed betrayed both sides during the war and absconded with millions, how did that change her understanding of her life at Shadow Creek, of the skills her father had instilled, of her own identity? "Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that your account contains elements of truth," Eleanor said carefully. "What assurance would I have that any partnership between us wouldn't end with my elimination once the gold was recovered?" The colonel smiled slightly, appearing pleased by her pragmatic approach. "Self-interest, primarily. I've spent 20 years pursuing this matter precisely because I believe in accountability. Betraying you after establishing an agreement would make me no better than your father." His expression turned reflective. "Additionally, my vendetta has always been specifically against Thomas Blackwood. You're merely collateral, an innocent party who happened to be raised by a man of questionable character. And yet you were willing to use me as leverage against him," Eleanor pointed out, "potentially harming this innocent party to achieve your objectives. War necessitates difficult choices, Miss Blackwood, a concept your father understood intimately." The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly. "However, circumstances have changed. You've demonstrated capabilities that transform you from leverage to potential ally. I'm simply adapting my strategy accordingly." Eleanor maintained her outward composure, while inwardly weighing options. The colonel presented a dangerous combination of characteristics: intelligent, adaptable, and driven by decades of focused hatred. Any agreement with such a man carried substantial risk, yet he also offered potential insights into Thomas Blackwood's true nature and history that Eleanor might never obtain otherwise. "I need time to consider your proposition," she said finally, "and verification beyond these documents." The colonel nodded, unsurprised. "A reasonable request. Though I should note that time works against both of us. Your father is approaching Shadow Creek as we speak, likely with his own contingency plans in motion. Once he arrives, the dynamic will shift again, potentially limiting your options significantly." As, if summoned by his words, a sound from outside caught Eleanor's attention. The distant but distinctive cadence of approaching horses, moving at a controlled trot rather than a gallop. Not the ranch hands who weren't expected for days. Not casual travelers who would follow the main road rather than approaching the ranch house directly. The colonel heard it too, his expression sharpening with anticipation. "It seems, Miss Blackwood, that circumstances have accelerated our timeline. Those aren't territorial marshals. Their approach is too cautious, too deliberate." His scarred face formed a knowing smile. "Your father has arrived, and judging by the multiple horses, he's not alone." Final part. The truth revealed. Dawn painted Shadow Creek Ranch in shades of amber and gold as Thomas Blackwood and his companions approached. Eleanor watched from the guest bedroom window, her Remington still trained on the colonel, her mind racing through possible scenarios. The riders moved with practiced coordination, establishing a perimeter around the ranch house without a word exchanged between them. "Your father always did have a flair for tactical deployment," the colonel observed, his tone almost appreciative despite the circumstances. "Those aren't ordinary ranch hands or local lawmen. Former military, I'd wager. Special operations, based on their movement patterns." Eleanor said nothing, focused on the lead rider who had now dismounted and approached the house. Even at a distance, she recognized her father's distinctive gait, the slight favor to his right leg from an old war injury, the measured pace that wasted no motion. Thomas Blackwood moved like a man accustomed to having his every step observed and analyzed. "Miss Blackwood," the colonel said quietly, "whatever you decide, I suggest we meet your father together. Apart, we each represent only partial truths. Together, we might finally force complete honesty from a man who has spent decades avoiding it." Eleanor considered his proposal, weighing risks against potential benefits. The colonel, despite being her adversary, had provided insights about Thomas Blackwood that aligned disturbingly well with questions she'd harbored for years. Confronting her father alongside him might indeed yield more complete answers than she'd get otherwise. "Very well," she decided, "but you'll remain at gunpoint, and any attempt to escalate the situation will end poorly for you." The colonel nodded, accepting her terms with surprising equanimity. "Understood. Though I suspect the coming conversation will prove volatile regardless of our intentions." They descended the stairs together, Eleanor maintaining a careful distance behind the colonel. As they reached the main floor, the front door opened to reveal Thomas Blackwood, trail-worn but alert, his weathered face revealing nothing as he took in the scene before him. "Pa," Eleanor acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. Thomas Blackwood's steel-grey eyes moved from his daughter to the colonel, registering Eleanor's combat-ready stance, the Remington aimed at her captive and the transformed atmosphere of Shadow Creek Ranch. "Eleanor," he replied, his expression softening momentarily, before hardening again as he addressed the colonel. "James, it's been a long time. 20 years, 4 months and 16 days, the colonel responded precisely. "Though who's counting?" Thomas stepped fully into the house, removing his dusty hat. Eleanor noted how his right hand remained casually near his holstered revolver, how his eyes continuously scanned for threats despite his outwardly relaxed demeanor. "I see you've met my daughter," Thomas observed dryly. "A remarkable young woman," the colonel replied, "though perhaps not quite the innocent rancher's daughter you've presented to the world. Your training methods have proven impressively effective." Thomas's eyes found Eleanor's, searching for something in her expression. "You've secured the situation, then?" "Reed and the Dentons are restrained in the barn," Eleanor reported automatically, falling into the familiar pattern of providing tactical information, a pattern she now recognized as further evidence of her father's specialized influence. "Wade is locked in the upstairs linen closet. All have been disarmed and pose no immediate threat." Thomas nodded, pride briefly visible in his features before being replaced by something more complex, concern perhaps, or regret. "And the colonel has been attempting to sway you with his version of history, I imagine." "He's made certain claims," Eleanor acknowledged, conscious of choosing her words carefully, "about Confederate gold shipments, about your activities during and after the war, about the true source of Shadow Creek's founding resources." Something flickered in Thomas Blackwood's eyes, not guilt or anger, but a deep weariness, as though a burden carried for decades had suddenly grown heavier. "I expected this day would come eventually," he said quietly, "though I'd hoped to approach it differently." He glanced at the colonel. "James always was persistent. 20 years hasn't dulled that quality, I see." "Some betrayals can't be forgotten, Thomas," the colonel replied, his controlled tone belied by the tension visible in his shoulders. "Some debts must eventually be settled." Thomas Blackwood sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years and more. Eleanor deserves the truth, the complete truth, not just your vengeful interpretation of events. He turned to his daughter. The men outside will maintain perimeter security. This conversation should remain private, between the three of us. Up. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.